Everything in the surface world of Bloodborne can be traced back to the lands which lie beneath the surface, the winding labyrinth known to some as the Tomb of the Gods. Indeed, it is within these hallowed corridors that the story truly begins, with the Great Ones, with the Pthumerians, and with the Byrgenwerth scholars who pierced its dusty innards, hoping to uncover the truth of their world's greatest mysteries. This intriguing and mysterious maze is home to numerous civilizations, but most fascinating of all are the haunting Pthumerians, servants of the gods, bound by blood pact, a race almost as alien to humanity as the Great Ones themselves. This is the story of a civilization growing from humble origins to regal monarchy, before collapsing into primitive warbands represented by the Watchers, pale shadows of their royal Pthumerian ancestors. And now within the empty corridors of the Labyrinth, we just get glimpses of the greatness that was once the Pthumerian kingdom. For me, my great love for Bloodborne is so deeply tied to those dusty walls and winding corridors, and so I ask you to join me this week as we dive into the heart of the Labyrinth and of Bloodborne itself. But before we get started, I want to acknowledge some creators whose work has been very influential on this video, and that is Bob the Hollow and Last Protagonist. And as always, I'm going to give a shout out to Lokey, author of Abyssal Archive, for their insights and translations that I will reference throughout. And before we get started guys, remember that if you like Bloodborne lore, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. This video was originally going to be about all three distinct cultures within the Labyrinth, Ys, Laurence and Pthumeru. However, as you can no doubt see by the size of this video, the Pthumerians alone warranted their own video, and I will eventually cover Laurence and Ys in another video. But before we start looking at the Pthumerian culture, I think it behooves us to look at the nature and structure of the Labyrinth itself. The first thing to note is that while we experience the Labyrinth through the nebulous Chalice dungeons, it is a real physical place that exists below Yharnam itself, and we learn of this via Alfred, who says the following.
And the tomb of the gods, carved out below Yharnam, should be familiar to every hunter.
We discussed this in my choir lore video, but it seems like the Labyrinth was essentially discovered at Byrgenwerth. In Lokey's lore article on Byrgenwerth, he points out the fact that Byrgenwerth is Germanic for worth of the burial place, which is obviously relevant when we consider the Labyrinth is also called Tomb of the Gods. And Lokey believes that Byrgenwerth is established where it is because of the graves that we find in the area surrounding the Forbidden Forest, including some found right outside Byrgenwerth where we fight the shadows of Yharnam. There are a lot of hints that these graves are connected to the Labyrinth itself, and a point well made by Charred Thermos, who has unfortunately now deleted their channel, is that the Labyrinth is referred to as a Tomb of the Gods by Alfred, suggesting that it is a burial ground for gods. Thus the presence of these massive graves as the sort of outer or upper level of the Labyrinth makes a lot of sense. This becomes even more apparent when you consider the visual evidence as well, as we see slugs, most likely pearl slugs, writhing on the surface of some of these graves, suggesting they have slipped out from the Labyrinth. And aside from these interesting observations, common sense would dictate that a school founded to study the Labyrinth, Byrgenwerth, would be situated close to the subject of said study. Indeed, one of Willem's attendants, Dorez, further hammers home the idea that the entrance to the Labyrinth is found among these graves, in the Forbidden Forest surrounding Byrgenwerth. Dorez is the prior owner of the Grave Guard attire, one of the coolest outfits in the game incidentally. Now the appearance of the outfit kind of speaks for itself. It's clearly modelled after a Pthumerian itself, heavily implying that Dorez in their duties as a Grave Guard came into contact with Pthumerians. This is more or less confirmed by the Grave Guard mask item description, which reads the following. Mask of Dorez, Grave Guard of the Forbidden Woods. His pale countenance mimics the Labyrinth Watchers. Willem kept two loyal servants back at Byrgenwerth. When they were sent into the Labyrinth, they encountered the Eldritch Truth and went mad. One became the password gatekeeper, while Doris became a graveguard of the forest. so this gives us a lot of information. Firstly, it does tell us that Dorez and Willem's other servant was indeed sent into the Labyrinth, once again reinforcing the idea that the Labyrinth is located around these graves, or at least around Byrgenwerth. Secondly, it mentions Watchers, and while the Watchers are something separate from the Pthumerians, I do believe, as I will explain, that they are descendants of the Pthumerians after the civilization collapsed, and I do think this is quite clear given their visual identity is very close in nature to those Pthumerians. But yes, long story short, the entrance to the Labyrinth, I believe, is around these graves in the forest, and in Lokey's Byrgenwerth article they even point out a hatch on the lowest floor of the Byrgenwerth school itself, suggesting that this too could be an entrance into the Labyrinth that students and Willem used whenever they needed to do a field trip. And I go over all of this information just to reinforce the idea that the Labyrinth is a real physical place in the waking world of Bloodborne, it's just that we don't experience it that way. Now, before we go any further and dive into the Labyrinth ourselves, it is time for us to fuel up with today's sponsor. Today's video is brought to you by Hellofresh, who are once again feeding the lore, and I couldn't be more delighted, as it is a product I personally use in my day-to-day life. As someone who is glued to their PC almost 100% of the time, Hellofresh has thankfully been keeping me well fed and off the takeaways, by delivering pre-portioned ingredients and simple to prepare recipes right to my door. One of my personal favourites is this hot and crispy chicken burger with sriracha mayo and sesame chips. Really a step up from the meals I used to eat as an executioner in Anor Londo. Perhaps now Gwen will let me become a knight. But for those who want to spend as little time as possible in the kitchen, Hellofresh has fast and fresh recipes that can be ready in as little as 15 minutes. But the thing I love about Hellofresh the most is the sheer variety of recipes, with 40 plus every week, meaning there's plenty to choose from, no matter your dietary requirements or personal taste. And best of all, the ingredients are fresh and tasty, with the journey from farm to your fridge being under 7 days. So use my link or go to hellofresh.com and use the code POGSMOOG50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Thanks again to Hellofresh for sponsoring the lore, and now back to the Pthumerians. Bob the Hollow has an excellent video on the Pthumerians and the Labyrinth, and I will link Bob's original video below. Firstly, Bob points out something I had overlooked, in that it is actually the Pthumerians who carved out the Labyrinth originally, not Ys or Lauren but Pthumeru. As the lore Pthumeru chalice reads, the old Labyrinth was carved out by the Pthumerians, superhuman beings that are said to have unlocked the wisdom of the Eldritch Truth. I would suggest that the Pthumerian civilization is therefore the oldest of all labyrinthian civilizations. Bob then correctly identifies that while we can visualize Pthumeru Ihil as one of the lowest and probably most central points of the labyrinth, something reflected in this super handy labyrinth diagram that Lokey provided to me, parts of the labyrinth like the Hintertomb are the parts that extend outwards rather than deeper, the peripheral edges of the labyrinth as a whole. Hence they are called Hintertombs, meaning outlying tombs. And we know from the Hintertomb chalice description that they are continued to be expanded outwards by the Watchers, and we'll talk about the Watchers and their relation to Pthumerian culture in the last part of this video. But I just wanted to give you some idea of the probable structure of this labyrinth, with the centre of the Pthumerian kingdom likely being the most central and deepest part of the labyrinth, but the Hintertombs and outer Pthumerian layers being the levels that the Byrgenwerth scholars most likely first entered by. And so when it comes to Ys and Lauren, given that they are connected to the labyrinth which we have just established must have been carved out by the Pthumerians in the first instance, we could possibly speculate that these are either contemporary civilizations to the Pthumerians or offshoots who developed their own culture and identity over time. I think the latter is quite likely given the actual corridors found even within these parts of the labyrinth share the same symbology found in the Pthumerian labyrinth. There are just some cosmetic differences, with different enemy types that represent each culture's different way of trying to connect to the cosmos and the Great Ones. But let me know your thoughts on the actual structure of the labyrinth in the comments below. One final specific about the labyrinth we need to discuss before moving on to the early history of the Pthumerians is the Chalice Dungeons, a subject we have touched on before in my Great Ones video, but we will do so again here for the sake of completeness. I believe that the Chalice Dungeons are pocket dimensions or dreams that reflect a segment of the Labyrinth as a specific instance or moment in time. In my choir video, I highlighted the fact that every time we open the Ease Chalice Dungeon, we fight Ebrietas, despite the fact that Ebrietas now exists in the waking world in the orphanage. Even if we have killed Ebrietas in the waking world, we are able to use this chalice and face them again, and should we cancel the Chalice Dungeon and redo the ritual, we can face Ebrietas for another time, showing that every time you use this chalice, it is just a singular pocket or moment in time that is being recreated, no matter how many times you do the ritual. Indeed, Bob made an amazing observation which I had never noticed before, and I feel so silly for missing it. This observation is that the Yharnam we meet in the Nightmare of Mensis, the current consciousness of Queen Yharnam, is postnatal, as we can see from her figure and the very fact that Mergo now exists and she is here weeping for her lost child. And yet the Queen Yharnam we face in the Chalice Dungeons is still pregnant, as again we can see this from her figure, and I'd actually never noticed this before. And so once again this reinforces the fact that the Chalice Dungeons and the Chalice Rituals are just creating a pocket dimension that reflects a certain instance of time. And in the case of Pthumeru it is recreating the moment when Queen Yharnam was still pregnant. With the nature and physicality of the Labyrinth somewhat outlined, let us now explore the origins of the Pthumerian civilization. I think one of the best places to start when discussing the Pthumerian people is probably with the Pthumeru Chalice, which reads the following. Pthumeru was the title of both the Pthumerian monarch and its capital. This reveals that while early Pthumerians were mere humble guardians of the slumbering Great Ones, their descendants felt entitled to name themselves a leader. So this has a lot of interesting starting points for us, as we begin to unpack the story of this great civilization. What this chalice is saying is pretty straightforward but really interesting. It is saying that while later Pthumerians had a monarchy and were their own nation essentially, those that came before them, their ancestors, were only humble guardians. They had no nation of their own, or even any leadership, they just existed to serve the Great Ones. And if we combine this with the lore found in the lower Pthumeru chalice, then the implication is that the Pthumerians carved out the Labyrinth firstly for the Great Ones, not for their own nation, and that it was only later converted as the location of their civilization. And so right at the onset, I think it paints the picture of a society, of a people, that has a close, intimate relationship with the Great Ones. The very origins of these people is rooted in that connection. This is where I think it's worth looking at the actual design of the Pthumerians, and it is so distinctive and it really conveys a certain feeling to the player because it's done so well. And so let's try and unpack it, because it goes a long way in selling the otherness of the Pthumerians despite them being humanesque in appearance. Where the beasts of Yharnam give us a sort of werewolf aspect to the gothic horror, the Pthumerians and the Vilebloods provide the vampiric aspect to it. But specifically their faces are of course a reference to the famous painting by Edvard Munch called The Scream, and much like the Pthumerians themselves, the visual design of this painting gives off very powerful feelings. The painting of course means different things to different people, but in general it shows a human emitting a primal scream. To me it speaks of existential horror, facing some truth or realization that triggers almost animalistic despair. That existential fear or angst is best described from the words of the artist himself, who described the events that led up to him painting this incredible piece. The following quote comes from his diary in 1892. I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun went down. I felt a gust of melancholy. Suddenly the sky turned a bloody red. I stopped, leaning against the railing, tired to death, as the flaming skies hung like blood and sword over the blue-black fjord and the city. My friends went on. I stood there trembling with anxiety, and I felt a vast infinite scream through nature. I think what Munch describes here of someone being so overcome with what they have witnessed and felt that you almost cannot bear it is very similar to the depictions in Bloodborne of people who are exposed to the Eldritch Truth. Indeed, even Munch's description here of him feeling a vast infinite scream through nature really does make me think of a human in the world of Bloodborne realising the true nature of the cosmos, the Eldritch Truth. Thus, to me, I believe the appearance is partly meant to convey this constant exposure to the Eldritch Truth, a kind of permanent expression of shock that permeates their entire people. Bear in mind that this is the expression and face that Dorez, the Graveguard, takes as his own mask after experiencing the Eldritch Truth himself. However, I also think there is another facet that has contributed to their ghoulish appearance, and this is blood dregs or corrupted blood, known in the game as vile blood. This is a material that I suggest is central to their blood pacts, their marriages to the Great One, a tradition carried on by the vile bloods of Cainhurst, but we will talk about that later. But much like blood ministration affects the people of Yharnam to the point where they turn into beasts, I believe that the Pthumerians' attempts at using blood dregs to make the perfect host, the perfect surrogate for the Great Ones, has contributed to their ghoulish and vampiric appearance. If we once again look at the lower Pthumeru chalice, we can see that the Pthumerians are referred to as superhuman. By its very definition, a superhuman are beings that are beyond human, and in the case of the Pthumerians, whether this is a result of their nature, or if it's due to their close relationship with the Great Ones, or if it's to do with their experimentation with blood dregs as we've just discussed, I will leave it up to you to decide. Before we move on, it is worth noting that Lokey offers a different, more straightforward explanation as to why the Pthumerians appear the way they do. Simply that it's a result of them living underground for generations. To quote Lokey now, prolonged shade from the sun turned these humans inhuman, with deathly pale skin and sunken black eyes. Whatever is a contributing factor, we can see that they do possess certain superhuman elements to them. When we face true Pthumerians like the Pthumerian Elder or Queen Yharnam, we can see that they possess certain superhuman abilities. For example, both Yharnam and the Pthumerian Elder are able to teleport at will. The Pthumerian Elder is able to summon weapons almost at will, seemingly. And Queen Yharnam's abilities go far beyond even this, being able to project different copies of her that can actually attack and harm enemies if they need to. I would say in Yharnam's case it is most likely that the cause of her powers is her corrupted blood, the build-up of blood dregs, as a lot of her abilities have to do with manipulating blood, forming them into spears for example. But the fact that even her spraying her blood on us actually does damage to us really does hammer home that her blood is vile and that it is the source of her power. However, as we discussed earlier, the blood monarchy of the Pthumerians is not something that came about until later on, and before that they were just superhuman beings that were humble guardians, and thus some of their superhuman elements must be intrinsic to their race. But let me know in the comments below what you believe is the source of their superhuman nature. But in what way were the early Pthumerians guardians of the Great Ones? This brings me back to the original purpose of the Labyrinth, something I alluded to earlier. Later it would become a kingdom, but it started out as a labyrinth that was carved by the Pthumerians in service of the Great Ones, taking the Pthumeru Ehil and Lower Pthumeru Chalice together. Let's talk briefly about the semantics of the word Pthumeru itself, and what it could even mean. Thanks to Lokey, we do have some idea, and I quote Lokey now. Pthumeru, or Tumor, is an obvious portmanteau of the English tomb and the ancient civilization of Sumer, so essentially the tomb civilization, which makes sense given this is a civilization born out of tombs that they carved for their gods. Also, consider the design of the labyrinth itself. Alfred refers to it as the Tomb of the Gods, and indeed, the interior of the labyrinth does remind me of a tomb, or catacombs, or the interior of the pyramids, for example. For me, this does reinforce that the labyrinth was a tomb first, a civilization second. Does the term Tomb of the Gods literally mean that the gods, or the Great Ones, were actually buried in here? Well, that is actually a complex question, but again, it is one we will attempt to unlock. A fascinating scene awaits us in the Altar of Despair in Upper Cathedral Ward. We find Ebrietas staring sadly towards the corpse of a being that very much resembles Rom, and yet we later face Rom, and we know that the Rom we actually do fight is not a vision or a dream, as this Rom is having an effect on the waking world by hiding the ritual of Mensis. The explanation as to how this is possible, why there is a corpse of Rom, and yet we face Rom, is again something we looked at in more detail in my Great Ones lore video. But in short, item descriptions like the Great One's wisdom and the umbilical cord that talks about Willem suggest that the main difference between the Great Ones and a regular human is the elevated nature of their mind, that they have the ability to think and operate on multiple planes of existence, on higher planes, essentially having the level of mind that can operate within these dreams, within the cosmos. And we can see that this is quite well illustrated with the case of Ebrietas, who is referred to in the choir set as the left behind Great One, and my assumption has always been that Ebrietas's kin have ascended to these higher realms without her, leaving only her behind, and that in general it is normative for Great Ones to ascend beyond the physical. The very fact that these higher realms are referred to as dreams or nightmares should tell you the exact nature of these higher dimensions. They are realms of pure consciousness, much as dreams are in the real world. And that is why the more advanced Great Ones like Erden and Wet Nurse to some extent exist without a physical form. To be a higher life form in this universe is to leave the physical behind, to become more mind than matter, to leave behind your crude frame of flesh and bone and exist in a state of pure thought that we cannot fully comprehend as a human. In the case of Rom, it seems that when one attains such ascendance, they can transcend their mortal form and transform their consciousness into the dream. Now, there may be no set way of doing this, as we cannot tell how beings like Erden actually came about. Perhaps their mortal form just became pure consciousness and ceased to exist entirely. Despite this, we do find another similar example to Rom, of a being who literally leaves their mortal body behind when they ascend to a higher dream dimension. And I am of course referring to Micolash, host of the Nightmare of Mensis. We find Micolash's corpse in Yarhar'gul, and yet we still encounter his consciousness, fully realised in the nightmare, albeit he's gone a bit mad, no doubt as a result of him forcing this encounter, as normally what Micolash has achieved would usually be reserved for the Great Ones. But I would likewise assume that Rom's fate is in a similar situation, where she hasn't necessarily been killed, rather her mind has ascended to the higher planes, and as a result her body has been left behind and has died. And if that is the case, no wonder Ebrietas is sad here. It's just another reminder that she is a left behind Great One. So a long tangent to be sure, and I do apologise, but we now have a greater understanding of maybe why this labyrinth was called a tomb of the gods. While we don't know if there is a uniform way in which Great Ones can ascend, we do at least have the examples of Rom and Micolash to show us that in some cases a body is left behind when the consciousness ascends. Thus these tombs could be named as such because this is where the Great Ones' physical forms would go to their final rest, and it is these corpses that were buried and guarded by the Pthumerians, as the Pthumeru Ehil Chalice calls them, the humble guardians of slumbering Great Ones. Let's talk about the form that this guardianship would take by discussing three of the labyrinth's most iconic denizens: the Keeper of the Old Lords, Watchdog of the Old Lords, and the Rite Keeper. I think the Rite Keeper is a good place to start, and these are the witch-like enemies that can come in the crawling or the tall forms. While unusual looking, their appearance makes it clear that they are Pthumerian. Their appearance is of course very occult-like, witch-like, and their name suggests that they possess some religious or cult knowledge, and I have to say I absolutely love the aesthetics of these guys. The Bloodborne wiki, run by community member Meph, once again was a great source of information. On the page for these Rite Keepers, the wiki notes that we actually got an official description of these enemies pre-release, and this was available on the Japanese Bloodborne website, which would read the following about the Rite Keepers. Among the hunters survives the knowledge of individuals who pray for resting, a unique ritualist. People who do not know of the ritualist will be terrified by their appearance and demeanour. labelling them as disgusting and repulsive, whereas that may be just pure prejudice, perhaps. Be especially mindful of the ritual masters, who perform a dark and ancient ceremony that few have lived to talk about. Now, of course, we have to treat these descriptions with a massive degree of skepticism, as having looked at the others, and as you can see from this description, they are quite generic and don't quite fit in with the lore of the release game. That being said, I still think it's a good source when trying to understand the design intention behind each enemy. However, the last line is the most interesting to me, that refers to them as performing dark and ancient ceremonies. They are Rite Keepers after all, and so I do think this is in line with these beings as we see them in the game. This, in tandem with their name as Rite Keeper, leads me to speculate that these beings are ritualists who perform certain rituals in order to protect the Labyrinth, perhaps even with a religious element mixed in to honour their patron gods. The term rite is also used elsewhere in regards to the Labyrinths, in relation to the chalice rituals of the chalice dungeons. For example, in the description of Bloodshot Eyeball, which specifically uses the term rite. So to go even more into speculation territory, perhaps these Rite Keepers were also involved in the creation of these chalice dungeon rites, as if to preserve a part of the Holy Labyrinth, indefinitely in a pocket dimension. After all, Garmin does describe the chalice and performing a chalice dungeon ritual as a holy communion, and it is described in a similar religious fashion in the Pthumeru chalice description. There is another ritual mentioned in regards to the Labyrinth, and I refer to the mysterious process mentioned in the Bone Ash set, the set of the Keepers of the Old Lords. The Bone Ash mask reads the following: a mask made of bone ash, worn by the oldest Keepers. The Keepers who mined the slumbering Great Ones gained eternal life, preserved in ashen form, in a ceremony that cremated body and soul. The long pointed hat is a symbol of the old Keepers, and is considered evidence of their companionship, forged in a certain sin. The Keepers are very mysterious, and this item description describes a burning ceremony or ritual, which reduces them to ash, but somehow keeps them moving and immortal, so that they can serve as guardians to the Great Ones, the Old Lords. Given their appearance and affinity for fire, as well as a similar naming convention, I would assume that the watchdogs of the Old Lords are created via a similar purpose to these Keepers of the Old Lord. Both are very fiery creatures meant to safeguard the Old Lords, and presumably they were developed as part of the Pthumerians' guardianship over the Great Ones. As to how they actually work and how they came to be, it's of course impossible for us to get the exact right answer, but in this universe of Bloodborne, any magic, quote-unquote, is essentially arcane, the manipulation of the cosmic elements of this world, and perhaps they are essentially powered by some sort of arcane manipulation. However, I have always wondered if there's something else at work with these Keepers and Watchdogs. We have already spoken about how people who ascend to higher planes, be it Great Ones or humans, sometimes leave their physical shells behind. We only face these beings in the Chalice Dungeons, which again, we've already discussed, I believe to be pocket dimensions or dreams. Is it possible then that these Keepers and Watchdogs are actually people that were burned in their corporeal form, burned to death in the real world, in a specific ritual so that their consciousness could be shackled and exist as a guardian in these sacred dungeons? I leave it to you to decide. Ultimately, regardless of the specifics of how they work, I see them as the creations of the Pthumerians. However, something else is lost in translation here. The Bone Ash mask talks about how this is forged in some kind of sin, and this language is a little confusing. However, thanks to Lokey, we have a translation which makes the truth far clearer and far easier to understand. Lokey's translation reads, "The large hat tapered to a point is a symbol of the old watchmen, and considered to be proof that they were some kind of sinners." So this makes sense, that these watchmen are essentially punished for a crime or for some other perceived slight against their culture, burned alive in these fire rituals, and repurposed into something more useful. So to conclude, I believe the Labyrinth was first constructed as a tomb, a place where Great Ones could go to ascend, and their bodies, left behind, would be guarded by their servants, the Pthumerians. But in time, these guardians would become their own nation, and it is to the Pthumerian monarchy and their culture that we turn to next. My assumption has always been that the Pthumerian monarchy is matriarchal, because of the importance that women would have had in their ongoing relationship with the Great Ones. And credit to Lokey for pointing out the importance of an item description that basically outright confirms that this is the case, the Pthumeru Ehil Root Chalice, which reads the following. The Pthumerian monarch was traditionally a woman who assumed a name with classical roots. So yes, their monarch was mainly a woman, and this will make sense as to why when we go over this in the following chapter, but it also makes an interesting remark about her name, that they would assume a name with classical roots. And to me this is referring to the practice of a reign name, which is a name used by monarchs when they take up their new position that might not be necessarily their original birth name. For example, the last Queen of the United Kingdom was Queen Elizabeth II, but she wasn't born Queen Elizabeth II, she was just called Elizabeth, and her reign name was Elizabeth II because she was the second Queen of England to have that title. But there are examples of monarchs actually taking a different reign name than their actual first name. For example, Elizabeth's father was called Albert Frederick Arthur George, and called Albert by his family, but instead when he acceded to the throne, he chose King George as his title. And so, in short, it may be that Queen Yharnam is a traditional name amongst the Pthumerian monarchy, and she might be Queen Yharnam III or IV. And a lot of my evidence for such comes from the Vile Bloods of Cainhurst, who I see as the inheritors of the Pthumerian monarchy and analogous to their structure. They are two, led by a queen called Annalise. And so let's start by connecting Annalise and Yharnam, and why I believe them to be analogous to one another. Even in a video I did 7 years ago on Cainhurst, I already made this connection, but thanks to the great work of Last Protagonist, I am able to refine my understanding of why I see these two as analogous for one another. And this is thanks to Last Protagonist's seminal video on the Vile Bloods, which I highly recommend you watch, and I will link below. Firstly, Last Protagonist points out that in the original Japanese, Annalise is referred to as Cainhurst's Blood Queen, and Queen Yharnam in her PlayStation achievement is called the Blood Queen of the Old Labyrinth. So they are both Blood Queens, and what this means will become more apparent as we continue to explore them. Last Protagonist believes that this was meant to be an explicit connection between the two, but it was something that was lost in translation. To reinforce this intent, he points out that the full description of queenly flesh, the flesh left over by Annalise when she is murdered by Alfred, does describe her as the Blood Queen, despite the quick description not doing so. To understand the function that a Blood Queen plays, and why it's important to both the Vile Bloods and Pthumeru, we need to examine the function of the Vile Bloods. And as we move forward, I just want to make it explicit that credit for this goes to Last Protagonist, as I am drawing directly on his work to explain this. Last Protagonist starts by pointing out the fact that when you join the Vile Bloods, you get the rune Corruption, or Kegare in the original Japanese, telling you at the onset that this clan is concerned with unfiltered and potent blood. Indeed, when we give Annalise a blood dreg, she rewards the player by giving us some of her own blood, at which point she says, "Feel the spreading corruption burn," suggesting that her blood is indeed impure. As I've said already in earlier chapters, Queen Yharnam's blood is also actually weaponized against us, not just in spear form, but she actually just sprays us with her blood, which does damage to us, once again suggesting that both of these queens have similar vile blood. Another connection between the two groups is the rune Blood Rapture. What is interesting is that the wording here is ambiguous enough that it could be describing the servants of Queen Annalise, or the servants of Queen Yharnam, and it is dropped by the Shadows of Yharnam, suggesting it could be referring to Queen Yharnam, and yet it is also dropped by the Bloody Crow of Cainhurst, the hunter found in the Grand Cathedral that appears to kill Aileen, Hunter of Hunters. And while I am unsure about which queen this rune is referring to specifically, I do think that it aptly describes the role of each queen in their respective societies, and the fact that it is dropped by a servant of Queen Yharnam and then later a servant of Queen Annalise is an illustration of that connection. and could suggest that the shadows of Yharnam, who I believe to be the personal guard of Queen Yharnam herself, may have once played a similar role that the vile blood hunters now play for Annalise. They were both responsible for searching for blood dregs for their queen, so that they could be surrogates for a Great One. Additionally, the blood dreg item description gives us an insight into what we are actually trying to achieve by providing Annalise with blood dregs, as it reads, Queen Annalise partakes in these blood dreg offerings so that she may one day bear the child of blood, the next vile blood heir. And as we are continuing to compare the two queens, the concept of a blood child should resonate when we consider the importance of children to the Great Ones, and the fact that Queen Yharnam herself bore a special child, Mergo. One of the most basic facts of Bloodborne lore is that Great Ones yearn to have their own children. As the umbilical cord description reads, every Great One loses its child, and then yearns for a surrogate. Yet we can learn in-game that some surrogates are more suitable than others, and there is a specific reason that the Cainhursts and Pthumerians seek out this corrupted blood. As is highlighted by last protagonist, we can get into the situation where there are actually two sources of blood for us in Erdin Chapel, two people willing to give us their blood, Adela the Nun and Ariana, Woman of the Night. Adela is very insecure about the quality of her own blood.
Forgive me, I should have known better. What would a brave hunter do with lowly blood like mine? Please, forget I even asked.
And seems jealous if you choose Ariana's blood over hers, even looking directly at you when you're talking to Ariana. And should this continue without you intervening, Adela will eventually kill Ariana out of jealousy. You can even find blood on her gloves. And eventually, when the red moon is hanging low, Adela will try and kill you, thinking that your blood is tainted, given that you have received so many transfusions from Ariana. The reason Adela is so jealous of Ariana and why she thinks your blood will be tainted is because Ariana has ties to the vile bloods, meaning her blood is actually more potent than someone like Adela's. And the reason we know this is because Ariana is wearing the noble dress, a dress associated with the Cainhursts. Perhaps she is a descendant or someone who escaped the massacre by the executioners at the castle. Adela indirectly calling her blood tainted, as well as the use of the word forbidden in the item description of Ariana's blood, helps cement her connection to the vile bloods. And while the church might deem their blood forbidden or vile, it is indeed Ariana who is chosen to be a surrogate for the Great Ones. At the end of Ariana's quest, we find her with a cosmic child, and we find the source of this child via the umbilical cord that it drops when killed. It reads the following: every Great One loses its child, and then yearns for a surrogate, and Erdin, the formless Great One, is no different. To think it was corrupted blood that began this eldritch liaison. This plainly says that it was Ariana's corrupted or vile blood that was the reason she was chosen by Erdin to be its surrogate. Ariana, not Adela. Adela herself is a young woman and you think would be a suitable surrogate. However, even if Ariana is killed and Adela is the only one in Erdin Church, she will not be chosen as a surrogate. It is corrupted blood that is the key. Last protagonist does go into the nature of corrupted blood, of the blood dregs, and why it's so important, but I will leave it to them as they do a far better job than I ever could. And again, I highly recommend their Vile Blood video in case you want to learn more. But in short, these blood dregs and corrupted or vile blood in general is just blood in a more potent and concentrated form. And the process by which you obtain a blood dreg is far more visceral in nature, as they need to be sought from the actual blood of hunters. Whereas blood ministration is a more kind of medical or scientific procedure, despite it being quite ghastly as well. And the reason they might be found in hunters makes a lot of sense. Hunters are beings who imbibe a lot of blood. Indeed, the blood dreg refers to them as echo fiends, as they consume a lot of blood echoes, and thus it makes sense that hunters and their bodies would be the source of the most concentrated of blood. Indeed, even in regular blood echoes, when you look at the more concentrated versions, you see almost embryos in the centre of it as if it is close to being able to produce an infant Great One. And in blood dregs, if you look closely, it looks like the male reproductive cell, as if this is also playing a role in being able to produce an infant Great One. And while it's difficult to say how this process exactly works, it is clear that having this concentrated blood within your body would make you a suitable host for creating an infant Great One. But again, the very fact that these blood dregs, this concentrated form of blood, is found filtered within the bodies of hunters, that hunters need to be ripped apart to essentially get at this viscera, again returns us to the image of vile bloods and Pthumerians themselves being closer to vampires than the werewolves that are born of the medical procedures of the healing church. The blood dreg describes these hunters, these vile blood hunters, as blood-lusting, and blood rapture describes the fact that they find almost joy in being splashed with blood. The corruption rune suggests that only vile blood hunters with this rune can see blood dregs within the blood, and indeed we will only get this drop if we are using the corruption rune. And so I would suggest that it is this rune that has an influence on the senses of vile blood hunters. Not only that they can see these blood dregs, but they sort of develop a lust for blood. Again, vampires. And it is also hinted that by having enough of this concentrated blood, these blood dregs, you gain immortality, much like a vampire. And I believe this thanks to the description of the Yharnam stone, dropped by Queen Yharnam, and the queenly flesh, dropped by Annalise. Both of these items suggest that Yharnam and Annalise continue to live despite the fact their bodies have been destroyed. I would doubt this is the case for Pthumerians in general or even other members of the Cainhurst royal family. Rather, Queen Annalise and Queen Yharnam are at the top of their respective hierarchies. They are the vessels that receive the most corrupted blood, and thus are so saturated by this form of life that they are unable to die truly. And this brings us to the Ring of Betrothal, an item that is found in the Chalice dungeons, which reads the following. The inhuman beings known as the Great Ones imbued this Ring of Betrothal with some special meaning. In the age of the Great Ones, wedlock was a blood contract, only permitted to those slated to bear a special child. While this ring is not explicitly mentioned to be connected to the Pthumerians, all this talk of blood contracts and special children of course makes me think of Queen Yharnam and Mergo. And again, Last Protagonist makes a great observation in his Vile Blood video that Queen Yharnam does appear to be wearing a ring of betrothal on her finger. And Queen Annalise, while rejecting your proposal, if you propose with it to her, at least seems to recognise what the purpose of the ring is, which tracks with what we have said about the Vile Bloods being the inheritors of the Pthumerians. And aside from this, the Ring of Betrothal mentions an Age of the Great Ones, where these wedding contracts took place, and to me, the Age of the Great Ones can only be the Age of the Pthumerians. Aside from the fact that this ring is only found within the Labyrinth, we also know that the Pthumerians had a much closer relationship to the Great Ones than humans do, and thus it would make sense that their era was called the Age of the Great Ones. In my Great Ones lore video, I suggested that Mergo's wet nurse was perhaps the Great One that was quote-unquote married to Queen Yharnam as the other half of her blood pact, that wet nurse used Yharnam as a surrogate for Mergo, and as such the wet nurse will have had a great influence on late Pthumerian culture. Mergo's loft in the Nightmare of Mensis is an interesting building. Firstly, it is called Mergo's loft, suggesting it is associated with the Pthumerian heir rather than with the School of Mensis. In Mergo's loft, the basic enemy types are known as Mergo's attendants, and while initially it might be unclear as to what these beings are, if they're human or other, if you look under their armour, it quickly becomes clear that they are Pthumerian. If the denizens of Mergo's loft are Pthumerian, I would therefore speculate that the building itself is either a reflection of the Pthumerian palace that Mergo was located in, or is literally the original palace that has been drawn into the nightmare, and Mergo's servants, attendants, were brought with it. If this is the case, then we can finally get some sort of insight into royal Pthumerian culture beyond the labyrinth itself. Inside Mergo's loft, in the main atrium, you can find bird cages hanging in large numbers. and this had always been a mystery to me, until I'd considered this building as a reflection of an original Pthumerian one, perhaps the palace that Mergo lived in. If this was true, and as I say, Wet Nurse was the other side of Yharnam's blood pact, and interacted with Pthumeru in some capacity, perhaps then these cages are a sort of homage to the crow-like Great One. Bear in mind the Great Ones are no doubt perceived as gods by the Pthumerian people, and perhaps these bird cages were filled with crows to honour their god, though I accept this is very much my own speculation. However, what is more difficult to ignore is the similarity that the Shadows of Yharnam have to the Wet Nurse of Mergo. Underneath their cloaks, you can see that these are essentially regular Pthumerians. They are just wearing a sort of black cloak. As I have said, given their name and analogous tie to the Vile Blood Hunters via the Blood Rapture rune, I've always assumed that these are the royal guard or servants of Queen Yharnam, her shadows. Indeed, their presence surrounding Queen Yharnam's position in the Nightmare of Mensis could be taken as further evidence of this, and yet I would argue that their appearance is meant to honour and emulate the appearance of Mergo's Wet Nurse, the god to which their queen was symbolically married to. Indeed, if they are analogous to Vile Blood Hunters, and they were meant to source blood dregs and sources of corrupted blood to give to Queen Yharnam, so that she may become the perfect surrogate for a special child, perhaps their outfits are a reflection of their oath to fulfill the agreement between Queen Yharnam and the Wet Nurse of Mergo. It may be a stretch, but within the Labyrinth itself we find statues that are comparable to Victorian-era photos of mothers and their children, known as hidden mother photography. And again, shout out to Sinclair Lore for making me aware of this phenomena in their Wet Nurse video. And I agree with Sinclair Lore that this is what the visual design of the Wet Nurse is meant to evoke, a sort of hidden mother figure, the hidden unseen mother to Mergo, and perhaps to Pthumeru as a whole. And again, returning to the statues found within the Labyrinth, perhaps these are designs, artistic representations of this Wet Nurse, unseen by the majority of the Pthumerian population. But aside from the blood pact between their queen and the Great Ones, what else can we tell about this society at the height of their power? Well, we don't get much, but there are some other things we can learn if we dig deep. We can surmise that aside from the queen, they had some sort of elder hierarchy, due to the Pthumerian elders who clearly have the title elder to signify their authority. Perhaps this is also represented by the staffs that they have. And aside from anything else, the power of these Pthumerian elders is very impressive compared to the other humanoid enemies that we face within the Labyrinth. We can also tell that Pthumeru had some kind of military, equatable to a medieval era army, as we see knights' armour and cannons littered throughout the Labyrinth. Further to this, there are enemies known as Labyrinth warriors, and while these are clearly far from knights, I do think they are evidence of a ruined culture's military, as the worn and falling apart armour could be evidence that these were once Pthumerian knights, or at the very least, they have scavenged Pthumerian knight armour and now wield them. Either way, in my mind, I speculate that Pthumerian warriors were armed like this, just a bit more refined. Another potential facet of Pthumerian society that we need to consider is witchcraft and the occult. In the earlier chapters, we looked at the Labyrinth Rite Keepers and the Keepers of the Old Lords as aspects of their guardianship over slumbering Great Ones. And a question that crops up in my mind is, did these rites continue when the Pthumerians became their own people, when they crowned a monarch? The fact that we can still encounter both in the Chalice dungeons does seem to suggest that the cult elements from their earlier age did persist into the Royal Pthumerian era. An aspect I didn't touch on though were the bell-ringing women, who are now used by the School of Mensis in their rituals, and again, as we can see from their features, they do appear to be at least Pthumerian descendants, if not Pthumerians themselves. They are found in the Labyrinth most numerously, aside from the Nightmare of Mensis, reinforcing their connection to that fallen civilization. The bell-ringing women seem to be able to pull Nightmare Apostles from other dimensions. We discussed this in my Great Ones video, but we know that these Nightmare Apostles, these spiders, were once humans thanks to a quote from Miyazaki himself from that original Future Press Guide interview, in which he spoke about patches. So the Nightmare Apostles, as their name suggests, are deeply rooted in the nightmare and dream realms. And as such, when I see a bell-ringing woman use their bells, I believe we are witnessing them use acoustics to manipulate the barriers between worlds, to draw beings from one side of a dream to theirs. This does make a lot of sense, as we do hear Mergo's cries in the waking world, despite the fact he is not present here. He is present within the nightmare, suggesting that certain noises do penetrate between worlds. And later we see the bell-ringing women being used by the School of Mensis to create the One Reborn. And as I said in my Great One's lore video, I believe that the One Reborn is a Great One's mind trapped inside a physical body, and it is the School of Mensis' attempt to trap a Great One's mind on this side of the dream. And the bell-ringing women play a role in this by beckoning the mind or consciousness of a Great One into this new physical form. And so to surmise, these bell-ringing women are just another Pthumerian device for them to make contact with their gods, the Great Ones. We don't know exactly what led to the collapse of Pthumerian society, but given the last queen of Yharnam, or at least some remnant of her consciousness, can be found in the Nightmare of Mensis crying for her lost child, we can hazard a guess. It seems like whatever is left of the Pthumerian kingdom is frozen at this moment in time. We find an instance of Queen Yharnam pregnant with Mergo in Pthumeru, the capital of their kingdom. And for me, these are the last days before the collapse of the Empire. Before Mergo was taken away from Queen Yharnam, her consciousness would soon follow, seeking a way back to Mergo. We see her after our fight with Rom, when we break the seal that hides the ritual, as if she has been waiting here, waiting for someone who can remove the last barrier to Mergo. And thus I think the taking of Mergo broke Yharnam, broke the monarchy, and thus the kingdom. Leaderless and directionless, over certain generations they would regress into the forms we now know as the Watchers. There is no other queen after Yharnam, and so to me she is the last of their monarchy, and the kingdom ended with her. With that said, let us now talk about those Watcher descendants, and the legacy of the Pthumerians as a whole. Despite the Pthumerian kingdom being a thing of the past, we see the signs of the Pthumerians everywhere, including on the surface world, where they have been put to work by the various factions of the church. It is not a revelation to say that the church servants, given their stature and facial features and pale skin, are of Pthumerian descent, as are the long-limbed kidnappers of the School of Mensis, which can also incidentally be found in the Labyrinth. Now, given all we have discussed, it might seem a little odd to accept that these mighty superhuman beings are now essentially used as menial labour or muscle by the church, but it does become clear that the Pthumerians are not quite what they once were. The Watchers are quite clearly degenerate descendants of the Pthumerians. Not only do they have similar features, but they are found within the Labyrinth after all, the collapsed bones of Pthumerian civilization. And just for clarity, there are two classes of Watchers. The skinny regular enemies of the Labyrinth, the enemies that you will fight most commonly within there. And then there are the merciless Watchers, the bigger fellas, who often act as bosses within the Chalice dungeons. It is worth noting there is another variant of Watchers, the Gravediggers, and these are the ones with the black cloaks, often seen with pickaxes, and are presumably the ones that help extend the Hintertombs. But the reason I bring them up is because these particular types of Watchers are even more Pthumerian in appearance, with their faces almost matching those of the Pthumerian Elder and Descendant, and thus it makes the connection between the Watchers and Pthumerians that much stronger. Returning to Bob the Hollow's video on the Pthumerians, he makes a great observation regarding the Watchers, the merciless ones to be specific. Bob makes the point that in certain boss fights, where you fight multiple versions of the merciless Watchers, that some are often referred to as chieftains, suggesting that these Watchers, the Pthumerian descendants, have reverted to a very basic clan structure. Their attire does seem to reinforce this idea. Rather than the fine silks of Queen Yharnam or the Pthumerian elders, these Watchers wear sort of barbarian furs, that you'd expect a barbarian or tribal culture to wear. Likewise, the extreme difference in weight between the regular Watchers and the Merciless Watchers, to me, is an illustration of a clan structure. While we, in a modern society, have access to plentiful food, and will often see obesity as a negative, as a sign of excess, in certain medieval cultures where food was finite, obesity was often seen as an indicator of wealth and position. I think in the case of the Watchers, the system is very clear. Might and physical strength is the only factor that matters when it comes to leadership. The merciless chieftains are the strongest among their clan, and thus are able to dominate their skinny kin, and in turn, they get the prime cuts of food by virtue of their position, getting stronger and bigger, and so the cycle continues. Alongside these Watchers, we have other primitive life forms that also seem to be the descendants of Pthumerians, that no doubt help make up these feral tribes. For example, we have the twitching Labyrinth madmen, that again have the features of a Pthumerian descendant, but as we can see from their behaviours, they are a far cry from that high Pthumerian culture. They are little more than feral beasts living in a cave. And in fact, they kind of remind me of the monsters in the film The Descent, which is a great horror film if you're into it. But the creatures in this film are heavily hinted to essentially just be humans who have lived underground for so long that they've become more feral, more bestial. And I see the same at play here with these Labyrinth madmen. We can learn a little bit about Watcher culture from the Hintertomb Chalice, which reads the following. Hintertombs are the peripheral catacombs of the old underground labyrinth. To this day, the Watchers continue to expand the Hintertombs, unceremonious catacombs filled with graves and death. These Hintertombs are not the original halls created by the Pthumerians of old, rather they are newer tunnels, carved out on the peripheries of the labyrinth, as we discussed in the first part of this chapter. I find the term unceremonious catacombs to be very interesting. The impression given to me is that this tribe is the successor culture to those royal Pthumerians, still possessing the knowledge and ability to dig out new tunnels, but without the purpose or artistry of the original Pthumerians. This is a culture in decline, a culture who continue to do as their ancestors did, but without the regard for why they did it. That being said, there is evidence that these more simple Watchers, these degenerate descendants of the Pthumerians, are still being led by more pure Pthumerians, for lack of a better word. Pthumerian descendants still exist, and while these are Pthumerian descendants, we can see that their features more closely match the Pthumerian elders of old, as do their apparel. The finer red robes that are closer to the Pthumerian elders, rather than the barbarian clothes of the Watcher descendants. And indeed we do find a Pthumerian elder in the lower Hintertomb Chalice dungeon. And to me it's not a stretch to believe that these more pure Pthumerians now hold a lot of sway over their distant Watcher kin, that these are warlords and leaders of this culture in decline, with the descendants and elders being some of the last of this ancient culture. We also have to consider the giants found in the labyrinth. Bob the Hollow in his video suggests that these too are a degenerate form of the once noble Pthumerians, a comparison that is hard to ignore when you look at the faces of the church giants and consider the likelihood that they were recruited by the church alongside their Pthumerian kin. Yet while the church giants are somewhat kept tame and normal and unmutilated, the forms of the giants we find in the dungeons are a far cry from this. Butchered and augmented and deformed after generations of living in these tunnels like beasts, it is difficult not to feel sorry for these giants, especially when you consider what's been done to their bodies. They are more or less weapon platforms, mutilated in various ways to make them deadlier. Limbs lobbed off in favour of blades, chains and weights nailed into their backs to make deadly sweeping attacks, and cannons replacing arms. We really are speculating a lot, but this speaks of a brutal culture to me, constantly involved in combat. What's my interpretation of these giants? These are Pthumerian descendants, brutalised by Watcher clans who are constantly engaging each other in barbaric tribal warfare. This isn't precise surgery. Some even have the cannons found in the ruins of Pthumeru's glory age, grafted onto their bodies as crude firearms. I do also wonder if the Eye Collectors and Witches of Hemwicks are inheritors of the Pthumerian Rite Keepers. While they clearly aren't pure Pthumerians, as their faces are quite different, it is hard to ignore the long-limbed similarity that they have to those Labyrinth Rite Keepers. Indeed, I would speculate that these witches try and continue the work of the Rite Keepers. They are mainly concerned with collecting eyes, as you may find out to your peril, and perhaps the reason they are permitted to exist in Yarhar'gul and the village of Hemwick is because of their knowledge of the dungeons and their rites, and they are allowed to carry out their work under the auspices of the church or the School of Mensis. Incidentally, the Chapel Dweller also shares a very similar model to these witches. Perhaps he too is a descendant of the Pthumerians, however distant, continuing the worship of his god, just now on the surface. And if this is true, combined with the church giants, the church servants, and the witches, it seems that the surface and Yharnam is one of the greatest concentration of Pthumerian survivors. The regression of this culture is why it's easier to believe that Pthumerian descendants have been enslaved to serve the church, either as muscle by the healing church or as kidnappers by the more nefarious School of Mensis. While Yharnam the city is built upon the bones of this ancient civilization and is named after the last united Pthumerian queen, it is not exactly a legacy to be proud of. A collapsed empire, either enslaved by a lesser race now, or fighting like beasts in the depths of their once great empire. The barbarian Watcher chieftains are a far cry from the regality of the Pthumerian monarchy. Perhaps that regality was once found in the vile bloods of Cainhurst, who seem to have somewhat mimicked their regality and culture after finding the truth of vile blood. But now even Cainhurst Castle is little more than a mausoleum, no different than the remains of Pthumeru deep below the ground, both monuments to slaughter and shattered ambitions. But for all their failings, there is still something captivating and extraordinary about the Pthumerians, a kingdom born from humble origins to a high culture with deep knowledge of the Great Ones. They are the literal foundations of Bloodborne and its lore. After all, there is no Yharnam without the Pthumerians, and there is no Bloodborne without the Labyrinth. So thanks guys, that is my take on the superhuman Pthumerians, an interesting and complex race. I know there was a lot of speculation in this video, but I do believe there's a lot to be mined about the Pthumerians if you look a little closer at the environmental details rather than item descriptions. But let me know your thoughts on the Pthumerians in the comment below, if you think I missed anything, and what you'd like me to cover next. Again, I'd like to give a shout out to Lokey for once again providing insights and translations, to Bob the Hollow for his excellent video on the Pthumerians and the Labyrinth, and to Last Protagonist for their seminal video on the Vile Bloods. And it would mean a great deal to me if you could go and support these creators. They will all be linked below. If you'd like to support the channel, then please give us a subscribe and a like, as I cover Soulsborne lore almost exclusively. If you'd like to support the channel in other ways, I do have a Patreon and channel memberships, as well as buy me a coffee for those who are looking to do one-off bits of support. But until next time guys, I will see you in the dusty corridors of the Pthumerian Labyrinth. Take care and have a wonderful evening.